Hello everyone and good afternoon. Welcome to this launch event of IEG. My name is Jose Carbajo. I am the proud director of the department in IEG who produced this report on carbon finance markets, and I'm going to be your master of ceremonies this afternoon. In addition to all of you in the room, we have a sizable number of people who have signed up online, and we will invite them also over them to ask questions in due course. The first person that I want to introduce is our brand new director for evaluation for our new DGE, Alison Evans, who just joined in January and who is going to welcome all of you. Alison?
I'm just going to put this down for a minute. I hope that doesn't disrupt. Hello, everyone. Welcome very much to this IEG learning event. And it's a particular pleasure for me to be opening this because this is my first event as the new Director General of Evaluation for the World Bank Group. So I'm particularly pleased to see such a great turnout, and also welcome to all of you who are watching online. I mean, it goes without saying that climate change is a real game changer for those of us working in development, and in many ways for the core mission of the World Bank Group. The latest IPCC report looking at the climate consequences of a 2-degree warming as opposed to a 1.5-degree warming of the planet, notes to orders of magnitude in terms of the kinds of effects that we'll be seeing associated with those changes. And of course, we all know that the distribution of the costs and benefits relating to climate effects are far from even, and it is the poorest countries, and many often the poorest people within those countries, those least resilient, those most excluded, who are likely to be affected most. And this, of course, is a huge concern for all of us. So we're here today to actually discuss an aspect of the World Bank Group's work in the area of climate mitigation, looking at particularly its work on carbon markets and carbon finance generally. And actually, IEG, the Independent Evaluation Group, has a broad and long-standing programme looking at different aspects of climate change and environmental issues across the World Bank Group, and this forms part of that. Recently, we've reviewed and assessed the bank's work to curb pollution, for example, and also looking at some of its efforts to support urban resilience. In the near future, so watch this space, we will also be releasing an evaluation looking at the World Bank Group's work on renewable energy. So the Bank Group has pursued a long-term commitment to curb global greenhouse gases spanning over 20 years. And carbon finance was one of the first and longest engagements for mitigating climate change, starting soon after the signing of the Kyoto Protocol in 1997. Climate finance aims to create and develop carbon markets as a tool for reducing carbon emissions. And the Bank Group has played, over that almost 20-year period, multiple roles and functions through its carbon finance support, from creating and developing carbon markets, building capacity, convening and providing thought leadership. Now, this IEG evaluation was actually finalised towards the end of fiscal year 18 and has generated a number of recommendations for the World Bank Group, which we are hoping are proving useful to the institution as it transitions to supporting now many of the commitments made during the Paris Agreement, and significantly increasing its commitment to support climate action. And we note very recently the latest climate agreement on action plan on adaptation that Laura was very heavily involved in. In putting together this evaluation, of course, we rely very heavily on the technical experts and specialists and management of those working in the area of carbon finance, and I'd like to extend my appreciation for their engagement with this evaluation across the institutions of the World Bank Group, and for their very active support for our efforts to develop a sort of an objective and impartial assessment of how the World Bank is doing in this agenda. In a very, very modest way, we're trying to walk the talk in IEG today So the lunch that you're enjoying has been catered according to the Sustainable Catering Guidelines. And I am assured by my staff that they have been followed vigorously. And if any of you don't know them, here they are. We will make every effort, including how we provide lunch, to try and reduce our own carbon footprint. So for the order of today, after a brief summary of evaluation findings by our lead specialist, who's sitting here, Bekele Shifaro, we have an outstanding panel of bank and external experts who will share their perspectives on lessons learned and the new challenges the international community is facing in harnessing the potential of carbon markets for climate mitigation. But to start us off, it's my great pleasure to invite Laura Tuck, who's the Vice President for the World Bank Group for Sustainable Development, to give some opening remarks. Now, Laura sits very much at the axis, if you like, of all these agendas relating to climate change and sustainability in the bank. So no better person, really, to open this for us than Laura. Laura.
Well, thanks, Alison. And I just noticed there are plastic glasses in the audience. I don't know if they're in the guidelines or not, but if John was telling me that they're recyclable, so if you have one, be sure it goes into the recycling bin. I should also say I was just in Katowice. Sorry, that's going to have to be up there for my notes. We were in Katowice. We were on a high-level panel about financing climate futures, and at the end, we were all asked what was the one thing we thought should be done, and almost everybody on the panel said carbon pricing. And so I am so happy to see how many people are here and are enthusiastic about this agenda, because my own personal belief is this is one of the fundamental pieces of the solution. There's a New Yorker article going around today talking about Nordhaus starting it back in the 70s, and it is the moment. So I'm really happy to see so much support, and I love anniversaries. So 2019 is the anniversary now of the Prototype Carbon Fund, which is pretty amazing when you think about it. It was the first of its kind to really formally launch us into this arena, and I'm really pleased to have IEG have taken the time to do this evaluation with us and really give us a chance to step back, look at the experience with carbon finance and carbon markets, and then see, have they worked? Have they really mobilized the kind of finance we want to see? What of it worked? What of it didn't work? And of course, today we'll hear all about the lessons that IEG found. But I'll just mention a couple points in these opening remarks about what we're taking away. So first of all, I should say that IEG found positive results, and we're very happy about that. We're very proud when IEG says something good. That means something to us, so we're excited about that. So I'm going to give you some numbers. They're big numbers. You probably won't remember the numbers themselves. Just remember that they're big. So first, close to $5 billion in results-based carbon finance was raised for both the public and for private sectors over the period that was looked at. That's a big number. And that is only the trust fund money. In addition, that complemented what came out of the balance sheet from the bank and IFC. We had almost 250 carbon operations that we implemented, and 170 pieces of analytical work were produced. 210 million tons of emissions reductions were delivered, which is the equivalent. People love equivalents. I never know. 45 million vehicles off the road. That does sound like a big number. So I think it's a big number. I think these are impressive. And almost a fifth of all the greenhouse gas accounting methodologies under the clean development mechanisms were developed and consolidated and supported by the bank group, and better than that, can be used by anyone everywhere. So I think that's pretty exciting. So remember, big numbers, lots of results. The second thing is the evaluation by IEG is really helpful for us. It gives us an inventory, which is nice, about the World Bank Group's carbon finance operations and all the activities that we undertook from 2000 to 2017, which is quite a period of time. And many of you know, and many of you are part of this process, we do our own reviews. We have the yearly state and trends of the carbon market and pricing reports, and we have the 10 years of experience in carbon finance. But this report is nice because it links all the different pieces. It takes the whole World Bank group together, the bank, IFC, MEGA, and you'll hear from some of them in a bit, and looks at all of the activities comprehensively, which I think is good. And then another thing, which is bread and butter from IEG, but the report does, is it really looks at the elements. What does it take to make this kind of activity successful? Doesn't mean you can necessarily do it, but sort of identifies what were those key pieces. So if you think about it, the kind of policies in international markets for carbon, like allowing for the trading of emission allowances, the international agreements that we use that had streamlined rules and procedures for implementation, like Kyoto Protocol, a lesson to some of those who are out there putting these agreements together about keeping them streamlined and easily implementable. And then there was support for capacity building for the client countries, but also for project developers at each of the different stages of project development, and that was very important to get this to roll out. Another thing the report does is and this is important for us as we think about the next stage of the World Bank under new leadership, is that the World Bank group can really provide leadership and initiate something as big and as important as carbon markets, and can really play an important role in making something like this happen. And as we think about moving then into the second phase, we are quite well positioned to do something about that. And as we help the clients work on their nationally determined contributions and their compliance with the Paris Agreement, this is a role that I think the bank group can play, and play very well. So, you know, when we started this, the global community kind of came together, held hands collectively, and took a big leap. It was a big risk. And then, as we all know, the market went up, the market went down, the market went all over, and we stuck with it. I mean, I think that was important. And even though it may not be with prices where we would hope they would be, that we've had a lot of progress. And I'll just mention 4 of the areas. So one was we actually pioneered the implementation and operationalization of the Kyoto Protocol. So that was one good thing. Second, we created and we tested the first iteration of carbon market infrastructure, including the institutions, the transaction infrastructure, and the regulations. Third, we developed and finessed the greenhouse gas accounting methodologies to measure and monetize the co-benefits of the clean technologies. And fourth, then what we do best, we actually invested in the projects that help transfer the clean technologies and open up the markets in emerging economies and LDCs. So that's, I mean, I think that is quite an accomplishment. And I just really, for those of you in this room that worked on it, we owe a big thanks. So as Allison mentioned, we have now launched our climate commitments for the 2021 to 2025, committing $200 billion from bank, IFC, and mobilization of the private sector. We will increase our direct financing, but we will also work to create this leverage. And of course, carbon prices are a big part of that. We need to create the markets for private business to invest, and carbon finance markets and prices are a super important tool if we're ever going to get to the levels we want to see for expenditure and investment on climate action, as you said, to really make a difference and to keep temperatures somewhere lower than where they're going right now. And I think that the evidence base that we got from this report is going to be really helpful for our clients if they pick it up and actually read it. Hopefully we can disseminate this information so they can find their own carbon pricing solutions. We've been working, again, on a customized basis, and to integrate carbon finance activities into the big effort now is to get it built right into the development plans of the countries, and then hopefully operationalize market-based mechanisms under Article 6 as the negotiations under the Paris Agreement. So let me just stop there and give a big thanks to IEG, a big thanks to those of you who've worked on these markets over such a period of time, and hopefully this will inform us as we go forward in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alison, for your welcoming remarks. Thank you, Laura, for your feedback. It's always very good and comforting to receive so much praise from operations regarding one of the IEG reports that we have produced. It's my turn now to introduce my colleague, Bekele Shiferak, who is one of the task team leaders of this operation. Bekele.
Thank you very much. What a great pleasure to be here in such a large audience today. Before I get started, I just wanted to thank first the contributions of the IEG team, which has worked a lot on this evaluation. And this was indeed a team effort. And I'm very pleased that we were able to actually pull this together at the end. And this is a very complex evaluation, looking at a very long period of time in the World Bank Group. And it was indeed very important to have the inputs of a lot of colleagues, some of whom are in this audience today. I would also like to thank John Room and his colleagues working on carbon finance, and for their strong partnership and collaboration in terms of really working on this evaluation. And their contribution and a learning experience that we had together was very, very useful. In today's presentation, I won't be going very much into details because we have a long report, etc., and we hope that this will entice you to actually look at the main report itself. But I will be going through some of these talking points, the 4 talking points here, with a focus actually on the main findings and the key implications. In terms of why it matters today, I think the VPs have already spoken about this, and I don't need to say a lot about that, just other than just saying again that given that climate change is a growing global challenge, and many countries actually need today flexible instruments that they can use for reaching their own national emission commitments, as well as raising ambition, actually, in terms of reaching the Kyoto targets, as you can see there, in terms of keeping global warming to below 2 degrees centigrade and working towards 1.5, as the IPCC report requests, is a major challenge. And I think carbon markets actually can help us move towards that direction. And the Kyoto, signed in 1997, recognized this role for the markets. And the World Bank Group soon after that launched the carbon finance as a market-based instrument and generated low-cost tradable emission credits working across developing countries and transition economies. And of course, as mentioned earlier, this carbon finance experience over such a long period of time and the continuing recognition of the importance of carbon markets under the Paris Agreement certainly offers a new opportunity for the World Bank Group to reposition itself in terms of what needs to be done beyond 2020. In terms of how we did this evaluation, there's no time for us to go into the methodology, but maybe suffices to just say that we used a mixed methods approach, which allowed us to triangulate evidence from different sources and generate evidence that informed our conclusions and the recommendations which came out of this evaluation. And in terms of the key questions, we identified these key questions which helped us really guide the evaluation. The first key question we had was, what was the objective of the World Bank Group? What was the nature of this engagement in carbon finance? And the second is about the contribution of carbon finance overall, across different dimensions: emission reduction, creating the market, co-benefits for sustainable development, etc. What were the contributions of this engagement? Third is about the leveraging carbon finance internally. How does carbon finance actually fit in the bigger set of things in the World Bank Group? And also, how does the World Bank Group work vis-a-vis other similar actors, institutional actors around the world? And the fourth is, because of the forward-looking nature of this evaluation, the fourth question was about what are the lessons which come out of this, and what does this imply going forward in terms of the future direction of carbon finance in the World Bank Group. We identified 4 major findings from this evaluation. These are around these core issues that you see here. First is about the responsiveness of the World Bank Group to the evolving global needs and changes, needs and priorities at different times. How does the World Bank Group respond to that? And you see there that the World Bank actually responded to these global needs and priorities significantly and adapting to market and regulatory changes. Yet, we found that some of these responses were also fragmented. In terms of creating markets, the World Bank Group was a key player in this. It catalyzed and pioneered actually the first carbon market transactions. And, but unfortunately, as we heard earlier, this effort, very successful effort, initial effort was not sustained. And the third one is about reducing emissions. Of course, many of the projects, activities that the World Bank supported were supposed to be reducing emissions and also contributing to our sustainable development. We found that the World Bank Group contributed to reducing emissions, but some sectors, especially the agriculture sector, transport, buildings, urban development, were underrepresented. And we also found that in terms of actually, even if when you compare it with a global portfolio, it was better in the World Bank Group than the rest of the global portfolio. Low-income countries particularly were underrepresented in this effort. We also looked at local co-benefits for sustainable development. These are the benefits for the local communities. And we find that the World Bank Group was less effective compared to the effort on emission reductions, less effective in terms of targeting and producing some of these local co-benefits for sustainable development. The World Bank Group, in terms of innovation and capacity building, it was also a key player in that. And we found the World Bank Group was largely effective in its effort in the innovation and capacity building effort. Another key area where the World Bank particularly played a very important role was the convening and thought leadership in the area of carbon finance and carbon pricing. And we found that the World Bank was generally effective in its thought leadership and also convening our carbon pricing efforts. I will go over some of these issues in slight detail, basically highlighting some of the key messages. In terms of looking at the responsiveness of the World Bank Group, we classified carbon finance over 17 years into 4 different periods. And these are like the periods you see there. During the first phase, 2000-2005, the key global need and priority was in terms of catalyzing, creating the carbon market itself. And recognizing that need, the World Bank Group developed 11 different instruments, which helped actually catalyze and develop the carbon market itself. But when the Kyoto Protocol came into effect in 2005, February 2005, the global demand for carbon credits increased significantly, and the World Bank responded by expanding these markets, building and further expanding these markets, and 6 additional vehicles were created. During the third phase, the global needs and priorities shifted towards mitigating the risks from the market crisis because, as mentioned earlier, the markets unfortunately collapsed in 2012. So the bank group responded by developing 5 additional instruments. And in the post-Paris era, as well, in terms of supporting the new effort after the signing of the Paris Agreement, the World Bank Group also developed 3 new additional vehicles. As mentioned earlier, the World Bank particularly was very successful in terms of mobilizing about $4.2 billion US in terms of trust fund, largely in terms of trust funds. This has helped diversify the portfolio across sectors and across different regions of the world, including the low-income countries. Unfortunately, this success was also accompanied by some challenges related to proliferation of carbon finance instruments, fragmentation, and challenges in relation to coordination and uneven monitoring and evaluation across these different instruments. The second area, the finding that we had, is about the creation of the market itself. Perhaps this is the most important achievement of the World Bank Group during these 17 years of work on carbon finance. And as was already mentioned earlier, the World Bank Group piloted and demonstrated the potential of carbon markets for low-cost emission reduction, and it helped because of the initial effort that it brought, starting from 2000-2005. When the Kyoto Protocol came into effect in 2005, it helped really operationalize the Kyoto mechanisms, the market mechanisms of the Kyoto Protocol itself. The market picked up significantly after that, reaching about $8 billion in 2007, and the bank group also reduced its share accordingly during this period. to create space for other players, including the private sector. And you see there, of course, that the volume of trade in terms of the CD, what's called the Clean Development Mechanism, and GI, the Joint Implementation Market from the Kyoto itself, really has been significant, peaked around 2007. But since then, the uncertainties in the market led finally to the collapse of the market, when the market prices actually plunged in 2012. And this is partly because of the external factors, mainly because supply really exceeded demand, and the world community could not agree on the post-2012 climate policy environment at the time. Third is about the reducing emissions. We have heard it in general. Up to 2017, the World Bank Group produced about 210 million tons of carbon equivalents in emission reductions through its various ERPA activities, emission reduction purchase agreement type activities, which it had implemented. In this portfolio, when you look at the emission reductions achieved across different sectors and regions, you find that the upper middle income countries and a few sectors, particularly the energy sector, the industry sectors, dominate significantly. Unfortunately, the share of emission reductions achieved from agriculture and also from transport and the building sectors as a whole was small. And also the share of low-income countries remained small, because the low-income countries started entering the market when the market actually collapsed in 2012. The fourth finding about the sustainable development or local co-benefits itself, we find that the World Bank Group was less effective in this area in terms of targeting and producing these local co-benefits for sustainable development. The main reason for this was that many of the carbon finance interventions were small prototypes, and they were not well integrated with the rest of the development finance within the World Bank Group. And sometimes we found that emission reductions actually happened, but they were achieved without a clear local social, economic, or environmental co-benefits. However, there are also variations in the portfolio. Some of the facilities, like the biocarbon fund, which supported or targeted clearly local development co-benefits, was able to actually generate tangible development benefits for the communities. Here you see in the picture an example of a reforestation program in the Humbo watershed in southern Ethiopia. You see the difference between 2002 and 2010, a significant change, transformation in the landscape, which also brought in significant benefits for the local communities, in addition to actually changing the landscape and converting it into a forest. However, unlike emission reductions, which were monitored and measured carefully, the local co-benefits for sustainable development were not systematically targeted and monitored. The fifth focus or finding was on innovation and capacity building, which was a very important area of engagement for the World Bank Group. We found that the World Bank actually developed a number of methodologies which were important, especially in the early years, in terms of operationalizing even the Kyoto mechanisms in some of the sectors and technologies. And it tested and piloted several instruments that helped expand the market over time and also help reduce the market risks when the market crisis happened after 2012 and during the period, the volatility that resulted from within the market. IFC and MIGA also piloted some innovative instruments and financial instruments, but they faced challenges in terms of scaling them up to a larger carbon market. Post-2012, we noticed the strategy has shifted more towards domestic carbon pricing efforts, or carbon pricing in general, and in terms of targeting actually some missed opportunities in the forestry sector, working in terms of what's called RAID plus, reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. And going forward, we note also that innovations around piloting of scalable approaches that contribute to raising ambition, consistent with the Paris targets would be really helpful. The last finding is about this role that we found actually during the course of the evaluation, which was a very important role that the World Bank Group played in terms of thought leadership and convening. And the World Bank has been really a key convener and thought leader in the carbon finance space, providing knowledge and advisory services on carbon prices, carbon markets, etc., producing a lot of globally useful flagship products, which were widely used in this space. And it also catalyzed new forms of partnerships, stimulating global and national dialogue, allowing developing countries also to experiment different types of instruments which work better in their own socio-economic and political settings, and identify those. And those have been taken up particularly as part of the nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. However, we also note that carbon pricing by itself may not be able to raise emissions to the required level in terms of coming consistent with the higher ambitions of the Paris targets, and it needs to be complemented by non-market efforts and domestic policy reforms such as removal of fossil fuel subsidies. By way of my conclusion, I would like to just reflect based on these findings, what does this mean in terms of the future direction of the World Bank Group in carbon finance under the Paris framework, under the Paris era. First is the important lesson that carbon finance needs to be integrated. It's about integrating carbon finance with the rest of the development in climate finance within the World Bank Group. Especially, carbon finance should help unlock new mitigation options which may not happen without carbon finance revenue or the carbon revenue itself. So that would be very important in terms of going forward. The second area is about leveraging carbon finance to crowd in private investments, as part of the MFD initiative approach itself. And in this case, what would be important would be to address specific risks for the private sector, and that may reduce investments in certain transformational options and enhancing the bankability of those investment options using carbon finance. The third implication is that it would be important to link mitigation with development and environmental co-benefits to target multiple wins. This is actually very important in terms of the launching of the new adaptation and resilience action plan recently by the World Bank Group. So this would allow linking mitigation with adaptation and resilience, especially important for the low-income countries like in Africa or for IDA constituency particularly. So this would allow carbon finance to be used for generating multiple benefits beyond mitigation itself. Fourth is about building on all of this experience and lessons, and the World Bank Group to reposition itself because it still has deep expertise and technical and operational capacity. Whereas some of this capacity has been lost across many of the institutions around the world, perhaps the World Bank Group is the only institution which has actually retained much of that expertise, especially here at the headquarters. So it would be very useful to use this and reposition itself in terms of what needs to be done in the Paris era. Finally, revitalizing the carbon markets will be important. This would require injecting new demand, rebuilding or restoring some of the trust which has been lost for the carbon markets, and targeting some new markets and opportunities, especially in sectors and regions which were underserved in the past. So I hope that our distinguished panel will be able to reflect and pick up on some of these key findings. And of course, in terms of going forward, for this to happen, addressing the global policy uncertainty that is prevailing at the moment, even after the COP24 discussions, would be crucially important, because that would be vital in terms of putting the future of carbon markets on a much more solid foundation than what has been the case under the Kyoto Protocol. With this, I would like to hand it over to Jose, our moderator, so that we can get started with the panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bekele, for this concise and important summary of the report. Now, if I may invite our panel members to take their seats, that we welcome. While they do that, let me make a couple of housekeeping announcements. All of you in the audience and all of you online, can formulate questions for the panel by using the following email address, www.polev.com/IEG now. I'll repeat, www.polev.com/IEG now. And those of you who like to tweet can also tweet with the following hashtag carbon markets. Thank you. So before we start, thank you all of you, members of the panel, for being here. Before we start, let me introduce all of you. To my left, I have Neeraj Prasad, who is the practice manager for the Carbon Markets and Innovation Unit. Neeraj has a lot of experience. We were talking before the presentation about the scars that you have of having lived through this experience over many years, and you have worked across many regions in the World Bank Group. As regional coordinator for carbon finance, you developed the regional carbon portfolio, which became at one point the largest in the bank. And now in your current assignment, you are leading the work on climate markets emerging from the Paris Agreement, on piloting climate policy initiatives, and supporting carbon pricing leadership coalition. I hope I'm not leaving anything behind. On my far left, I have Elzbieta Klein, who is the director and global head of IFC's climate business. And her role in that position is to provide thought leadership, fundraising, and facilitating all work related to renewables, climate-smart agriculture, agribusiness, green bonds, and other climate business areas. Elzbieta has many accomplishments, but among them, some of them in her career, she headed the IFC business growth in Eastern Europe in the early 2000s and led work in several industry sectors across the IFC, originating the so-called Food Fund, which created, is that correct? Which created the base of blended finance and impact investment in IFC, so an element of pioneering work there as well. On my far right, I have Michael Thoman, who is the lead economist on climate change in the Development Research Group and manager of the Energy and Environment and Agriculture and Rural Development teams.
You know, I've never been able to get that corrected. I'm the lead economist in the Development Research Group, but not the lead economist on climate change.
Apologies for that.
Lead economists on climate change in the research group.
Okay, thank you for that correction.
Thank you for giving me too much praise.
No, I'm sure you deserve it. Your current research interests, let me say whether we get this right, include alternative energy resources, policies for responding to risks of climate change catastrophes. Am I on the right track?
Yeah.
Okay. Timing of investments for greenhouse gas reduction, and mechanisms for mitigating greenhouse gas emissions through reduced deforestation. Thank you. Last but not least, to my immediate right, Maria Neto, who is, let me see if we've done our homework correct, lead specialist in financial markets and financial institutions at the IDB, Inter-American Development Bank. She is currently responsible for supporting the public development banks of the Latin American region in the development of green financing strategies. One important thing in her background, which we hope to tap from your experience, Maria also worked for more than 10 years in the Secretariat of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, where you were responsible for climate change, climate finance, and where you also were part of the team that established the institutional framework for the climate change implementation of the carbon market mechanisms of the Kyoto Protocol. So we hope to learn from you. Welcome all of you. Thank you very much for making the time to be here. And I'm going to start with you, Neeraj, because we know that you have a lot of institutional memory. The report of IEG clearly states, and one of the key findings is that the World Bank Group has been a catalytic player in creating and expanding carbon markets within the Kyoto framework. Now we have the Paris Agreement, where the international community must agree on operational rules for its implementation. Do you think that the Bank Group can replicate the success it had with Kyoto? What is it that it can do, and what does it take?
Thank you. I must apologize for my Johnny Cash impression, but that's a victim of the vortex, my throat. You've heard a lot in the earlier statements from Laura, especially summarizing our take on the report. I would exhort all of you to read it because we cannot put in 15 minutes more wisdom than is already there. It's taken 2 years to develop, and I think the team has worked really hard to bring it to where it is. But to speak of lessons from Kyoto and the sort of what we can take forward to sort of developing markets after the Paris Agreement. In the 1990s, late 1990s, we had several names, some of which were complementary, some which were not. Some people called us pioneers, others called us carbon cowboys, because we'd show up in various countries and spin this thing about this counterfactual called emission reductions, that if you reduce something, we'll pay you for it. We were operating in this environment of what was called CBDR. Those of you who are long enough in the tooth will remember common but differentiated responsibility. The developing world did not believe this was their problem, and it was for the developed countries to solve this, and they felt it was unfair to them to be loaded with doing anything for saving the world, so to speak. In that environment, for us, the most important thing was being accepted. We did weird things. I remember we pushed one of our managers to go and speak to Parliament in Jakarta. I don't think it's ever been done before on any agenda, but we sort of pulled it off somehow. More to the point, some people saw us as representing the sort of the ideas of Washington, D.C. Why are you guys hanging around trying to give us low prices for carbon? Others from the developed world saw us as unnecessarily interfering in the market. Why aren't you letting the private sector do what is essentially the crowding in of private capital that is needed? So what have we learned from all this? That you need to make sure that you are accepted in terms of understanding the policy environment, the local politics, the climate negotiations, and then doing what is right. It's not just rushing in to hide behind the words of an agreement and going forward. To summarize what we can take away, therefore, for the next generation of carbon markets, we must understand the policy context. Are there targets hidden in the nationally determined, I beg your pardon, contributions that we can use as a basis for bringing forward results-based financing? What do the rules say? Interestingly, Katowice just concluded the one thing it didn't take a decision on was Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which talks of markets. So here we are again in that delicious space where there are no decisions yet. Some of us consider that an opportunity to say that we will continue to experiment, to bring forward ideas while we wait for a decision. It gives John nightmares when he thinks about what he's going to say to me next time we talk about it. But I'm quite sort of comfortable knowing that this is what we have to do. We have to understand how we can take an agenda forward in the absence of clear guidance. The guidance hopefully will come in Santiago, and then we will move to more formalized rules. We need to understand the kind of products in the carbon markets. CDM and JI kind of will now look like Article 6.2 and 6.4 bilateral or multilateral transactions. We need to understand these. We need to be accepted as playing in these. We need to get all the MPVs to speak together so that we don't muddy the waters with various initiatives coming together at the same country with different offers from the ADB, from the ITB, from us. So we've set up working groups that will help us to make sure that we are in sync on all of these actions. Let me stop there on your first question.
Thank you very much, Neeraj. I think you have already pointed in the direction of many of the topics we're going to cover afterwards. One of the things Neeraj mentioned was private sector. And creating markets is now right at the center of the strategy of IFC and the maximized finance for development. The report of IIG clearly states that the World Bank Group played a key role attracting private sector. Now, Elizabeth, what is the IFC doing to create markets and attract private sector here, not just in general, but also in the specific of low-income countries where the risks are higher?
Thank you, Jose. Great question. So my team had a great privilege in helping to create carbon finance and then shutting it down. There are very few initiatives in a World Bank Group where you actually create something and you shut it down. My team had a privilege to do so. And it was not pleasant privilege because we did not want to give up. And we are not going to give up on creating innovative instruments that bring the market. The thinking has changed over the past few years because traditionally in IFC we have thought about supply and demand side of the market as given. So demand was there, and then we would find a financing solution to bring supply of finance to the table. And what has changed, Jose, and I think Alison alluded to it as well, is that we need to actually create that demand because it's not going to be created by itself. And I think that's the change of thinking that we have in climate finance in general, and hopefully in carbon finance in particular as well, that we just cannot sit back and wait for someone to figure it out. As Niraj mentioned, we are keenly awaiting results of COP25 that's going to be in Santiago, Chile in a few months. But we are not going to sit around and wait for that. There are a number of sectors where we can actually make a difference, even with the instruments that we have available today. And I'd like to highlight a couple of them. So one of the sectors that you mentioned were underdeveloped in the past decade were agribusiness and forestry. And we know that REDD Plus is prioritized by many countries in their Paris Agreement commitments. And we have done the first forest bond back in October of 2016. So even without a fully completed framework, we found a market mechanism where an investor can get either paid in cash or in carbon credits. It was the first, it was so far the only, but again, addressing the concerns of IEG on scalability, we are actively working on replicating this in many other countries. One more example I'd like to use is the example from the bottom of the pyramid, and that is clean cook stoves. Again, a seemingly intractable problem of cook stoves can be solved through carbon markets and through climate finance. And this is a more recent example where we worked with a local financial provider in Africa, Bix Capital, to provide clean cook stoves. So the message for all of us here is that the markets are deeply imperfect, and we are waiting for solutions that are going to come from international climate negotiations. But carbon has value, and climate markets are continuing to innovate because there is a demand and there is a supply. And if there's no demand, we need to find a way to create it and bring some of those solutions so that others can then replicate it.
Thank you. Thank you very much for those inspiring comments. Let me turn to you now, Mike. The bank group, and particularly when it comes to creating demand, which is the point that both our previous speakers have mentioned, the bank group was successful in demonstrating the potential of carbon market in certain sectors, right? But not in others. For example, it was successful in renewable energy, energy efficiency, waste, etc. Others such as agriculture and transport remain to be tapped. There is a lot of potential. So how can you think that the World Bank Group can help clients scale up and address this and probably create the demand necessary?
Obviously, absolutely key question, so thank you. Before I answer it, I want to, if you'll indulge me, just say that in addition to some of the veterans on the other end of the panel here, I'd like to just give a shout out to Ken Newcomb, who was actually one of the real parents of the prototype carbon fund. It's an absolutely audacious idea that we could actually create an asset called, a carbon credit or a carbon allowance, and turn it into what Ken and colleagues, including my colleagues here, did. And so it's a great example of taking a general principle and moving it from the abstract to the extremely successful applied. I'll also give a small shout out to Niraj, who helped to create one of the first option contracts for emission reductions for methane. And I think that's also a very cool thing. It illustrates the things you can do when you put your mind to it. So let me maybe take one step back. I think Niraj said something absolutely crucial, which is you have to understand the context in which you're thinking today, which is not the context of 1999 or the context of 2005. We are in a very different world now with respect to the nature of the international agreements we're dealing with, the nature of the national commitments that we're dealing with, and the nature of the policy instruments that would follow. So you have to understand the international policy and negotiating context, and you have to understand the circumstances of the countries in question. At the same time, I would be remiss as a pointy-headed researcher if I didn't point out as well that we have to try to make the best use possible of some general ideas to knit together something that otherwise would be kind of this Tuesday, it must be Sri Lanka kind of problem. So What are some of the principles that I think the experience of the last 20 years gives us, and that the IEG report points out very well? One is we need to actually separate out the things that we're trying to do. There's a lot that is being done by different parts of the climate change group here, and has been for some time, to help countries, especially our developing country clients, figure out how to use some kind of carbon pricing mechanism in the context of meeting their own NDCs. We talk about that as for example, Partnership for Market Readiness, but we also now increasingly talk about the use of a direct carbon price, that is to say, a carbon tax. We see that actually emerging in some countries, and our colleagues in the macro group have some very interesting points to make about why we should actually be thinking about revenue-raising policies because of development co-benefits that come from that. So we don't want to forget that the ultimate goal is, as Laura said, to create that incentive through a price. Prices can come in a lot of ways. The other thing that I think is crucial when we sort of parse this out is that when we move to the international domain, as in Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, there are actually, I think, two different layers that are in play. And some of my colleagues in the climate change group make the distinction, I think it's a good one, between carbon finance and climate finance. This is what is being discussed, for those of you that might be following this, in the context of blended finance. Climate finance means that we're looking at some kind of grant or performance-based funding to achieve transformation in the client country economies to reduce carbon emissions. Carbon finance, at least in my view, remains, as it did in the Kyoto Protocol, fundamentally a compliance question. The source of demand that we want to enhance is ultimately going to be those folks who will find it easier to, through Article 6, finance carbon reductions elsewhere than to finance them in their own countries. And so ultimately this means that we have to have effective achievement of the NDCs, and then a lot more, as you know. And that's what, along with the institutional developments through the Article 6 negotiations, will generate that demand and that supply. But there's a lot of institutional work still to be done, and we have lessons from the CDM. We have lessons from Kyoto, good lessons and bad lessons in terms of things that didn't work. So we need to be mindful of that. The climate finance side is not about carbon markets, but it's certainly about carbon mitigation. And I won't go into the details on that because it's not our topic here, but I do think we have to make that very important distinction and figure out how these two parts can play together to achieve what we said we wanted to achieve at the start, both global carbon mitigation and sustainable development. They often go hand in hand. They're sometimes complementary, but perhaps not hand in hand.
Thank you very much, Mike. You talk about the importance of the incentives and the experience gained from the Kyoto when the Kyoto Protocol was signed and implemented. And here's where I want to bring you, Maria, into the picture. Drawing from that experience and your current work at the IDB, what are the lessons that we can get from that process? How do we address the complex regulatory frameworks that are going to come with implementing Article 6 and carbon markets under the Paris Agreement?
Okay, I had the pleasure actually to have worked with a lot of people who are still around from the time of Ken Newcomb and after that. And I think one important role that the World Bank played and can play and should play still is the global convening role that the World Bank plays, and the support for a more open and, let's say, operational discussion on what is happening at the, let's say, global negotiation level to the ground. I saw this with the Prototype Carbon Fund, and there's a lot of good experiences, and I was part of some of these discussions on both the JI and the CDM. But I also think that the World Bank did a very important work on the forestry work on carbon, and certainly the FCPF efforts became a very important tool for the debate on the policy and how the countries should move ahead in promoting their RED policies and doing work on the ground. So beyond just, a project by project level, I think the convening power of trying to, at the same time, bring these regulators, negotiators that are not necessarily those that are going to do the projects, to have a space for discussing on how are you going to put it in place and bring private sector and other people to the table for the discussion is a key role. And I think the beginnings of the program also supporting, for example, certainty in pricing and taking the risk of developing methodologies or promoting certain types of projects, even when they were not necessarily approved or things didn't go through, was a way to show that it was possible, And I agree with Neeraj, it was difficult then when the market boomed, because then you become like a player that has to learn to phase out, and it's not easy, I think the challenge that comes with Paris, and the challenge actually of the market have dropped as well, is a couple of challenges. From the private sector, I'm working now on capital markets, so I agree very much what was said by IFC. I think the key issue here is to give some kind of certainty and create a demand. This is when we talk about a carbon market, it's a market that is created by policy. If we're talking about climate finance, it's something else. But even when we talk about carbon pricing, somehow is a signal from the regulators about this becoming something that has to be complied somehow. And private sector will follow if they have some certainty that this will happen. I think there is an issue we need to keep on the back of our minds is, on the one hand, I think on positive side, the fact that the markets worked as they worked, it showed to private sector that it was possible to do things and created a lot of creativity, innovation, and projects. And I see in Latin America too today a lot of experiences on the ground that helped actually the markets to develop. At the same time, the crash of this market shows also that the dependency on the policy and the instability on the markets, a lot of the private sector still remember it, and a lot of people lost money with it. So they will feel very careful about any idea of entering a market if there is no certainty or clarity on how to operate. When we talk about it at global level, I think there is other challenges as well, because it may take a while for it to happen. So I certainly think it's important to see how we are going to operationalize. Is not easy when we say, okay, we are going to have the pricing and we'll have the carbon defined at a national level, and then project by project, I will have to comply with it. This linkage between a national target and project by project is complex. So I think the World Bank has a lot to help because it is a global convener. The MDBs, and I think, Neeraj, the issue of methodologies you were mentioning, a good thing is that we evolved a lot since then to today, where I think at least from the MDB level on climate finance, we have a huge collaboration on this area and can certainly be a space, for a constructive and operational discussion around Paris. And I think it needs to take place in a more ambitious and integrated manner indeed. Last but not least, I think for me one challenge though is how to engage also, even from the government side, the right people at the local level. Negotiators are climate change negotiators. Some of the policymakers you're already addressing on the carbon pricing are important, such as ministries of finance and so on. But when we talk about market-based mechanisms, you need to talk also to financial markets regulators, capital markets regulators, stock markets, other types of players. There is a huge tendency on that internationally happening now, and I'm not sure I see the linkage very strongly yet to this community. Yet we have a TCFS that is discussing this on the financial markets. Yet we have IOSCO that just launched a sustainability debate on indicators. And there is a need to maybe rethink a bit also how you link up on this convening power, different players to discuss about these markets. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. That's quite an agenda of things to do. I have a number of questions prepared for the panel, but I'd like to bring the audience in now because I feel that the audience always gets the run on the stick. So I'm sure I don't need to warm you up, pun intended, to formulate your questions. If you would like to line up in front of the microphone and address the questions to our panel. Things that I would like you to consider is if you were able to say who you are and where you're working and who is the member of the panel that you're addressing the question to. Always takes a little bit of effort for the first person to. Yeah, I'm going to address the Polev questions as well, but I want to have the audience first.
Good afternoon. Thank you, and congratulations on the report and what the World Bank has been trying to do. Can you introduce yourself? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Greg Michaels. Just who I am.
Thank you.
And I'm a simple guy, so I took the numbers that you have there, the $5 billion and the 210 million tons, and sort of thought, okay, so that's $23.8 per ton. You could have gotten at California prices maybe 7 times that amount of carbon reduction. I say that only by way of talking about the opportunity cost of what you've done and trying to understand how you see the transformative and sustainable results of what's been done over the course of this time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can we take 2 more questions before we go to the panel? Have a cold audience, lukewarm. So let's address this question if there are no other takers. Mike, would you like to have a go at it?
No.
Since you mentioned, hold on a second. But this is as much a practical question as a research question, and you were the one who mentioned transformative interaction. So why don't you have a first cut and then we pass on yes.
Well, I think the arithmetic is what it is. I think that what we've gained from 20 years of experience in the spending of the money that Laura mentioned is a certain number of tons, but I actually don't think they're very important, with all due respect. I think what's important is what we learned about how to build institutions. Some things I think we're still learning. I think some of us are still perhaps hoping that things we've been doing for a while will keep working, and I'm somewhat skeptical about some of that. But I think we learned a lot about what we can and can't do. And so I don't know what the units of measurement would be for knowledge, but I think that's actually been really the value. The community development carbon fund, the biocarbon fund, the forest carbon partnership facility, these are all ways we actually learned about not only how to reduce carbon, but to try to make it be something that would be developmentally beneficial for wherever we were hosting the reductions. So that would be, I guess, my answer. I wouldn't think about the tons. I do think that the question about what's transformative in it is also relevant. And I wasn't a big fan, frankly, of some of the ways that the Clean Technology Fund was spent. I don't think it was always so transformative as it was just an inexpensive form of project co-financing, and I wish we would have done better on that in some cases. But I think there's, again, a lesson learned. What is it going to take to be transformative? Probably not just carbon finance. Again, transport is an expensive area to reduce tons in. So if we're only thinking about compliance, nobody wants to work in that sector. Nobody wants to work on cook stoves. We don't even want to lend in that area because it's so difficult. But those are the areas where climate finance can play a big role, or blended finance. So I think that thinking about transformation is one thing, and then I think how rich countries buy tons from less rich countries is another thing. They're complementary, but they're not the same.
Thank you very much, Mike. Yes, you want to
Thank you.
address the question as well?
Well, I guess the more you simplify, the more complicated it gets. Since I have the mic, to Mike I will say, Ken was the manager we put in front of the parliament in Indonesia, and he did a great job of it. Also, while I have the mic, I'd like to add that we've heard references to agriculture and underserved areas missing from the first generation of our carbon funds outputs. Bekele and I have become old friends over this report, and we've kind of agreed to disagree on this. Agriculture was not an eligible activity under Kyoto. That's why it was not there. We nevertheless pushed. I remember personally being involved in getting Kofi Annan to come and speak to ministers at what was it, COP11? It's been a while. I've sort of seen it move. I've seen the climate smart agenda, agriculture agenda move to where it's got to now, where at least some of us in the bank claim that all our agriculture is climate smart. But these are just caveats to put in to say that this is a huge learning process. The numbers, I will defer to Mike's sort of economic analysis of that, but much of that money which Laura mentioned is still at work. This is not the total tons. I know what is the highest price we paid for a ton, and it's half of what you pay in California right now. So there's been a lot of learning involved. There's been a lot of community-based action involved, and that is some of the benefits that you cannot easily quantify.
Thank you very much. Anyone else from the audience that would like to ask any questions? No? Okay, if that is the case, I'm going to bring a couple of questions from the poll. There's quite active activity going on there, very interested people. One of them is a question that I had for the panel as a whole, but particularly for those of you who are more involved, closer to operations, and that is, how can the bank group mainstream the carbon finance activities with development and climate actions? It's all about the co-benefits. How we can make sure that we are maximizing the co-benefits so that we exploit the synergies between mitigation and sustainable development. Any examples, Maria, that come from your experience in Latin America are welcome.
Maybe by not calling them co-benefit and considering, first of all, carbon finance as a co-benefit. And I think this is a bit the mindset that needs to change. I mean, in working, for example, in programs that I had the chance to develop in trying to promote financial intermediation, which is a lot of what we do, public-private financial intermediation. One issue is how you promote that, for example, small and medium enterprises start doing projects on energy efficiency or investing in distributed renewable energy or sustainable agriculture. And the point here is, how do you integrate the carbon pricing and the benefits of the fact that these projects have environmental benefits, in addition to the fact that it increases productivity, increases potential revenue, it has potential increase of job creation and other things. So I think it's a question of learning to see this as part of a more programmatic type of impact, and then including it as part of what we are looking as development. I think is not only for the World Bank, for the MDBs, is precisely the question on how you will start integrating this concept on what we do in terms of development impacts anyway of the programs we are financing. And I think this goes also aligned with the SDG goals that are becoming an important, let's say, feature. Giving another example, recently IDB has been doing more and more on the green bond market, but we see also a huge demand in our region to start talking more and more about sustainable bonds and SDG bonds that include the green and the potential actually carbon accounting for that, but not only. And it is important to be able to have this more holistic understanding and integrate this concept if we want to leverage, particularly as MDBs, that in our development activities.
Thank you very much, Maria. Let's be done. Yep.
I'll add a couple of things to it. If we want to make a difference, we can do it ourselves. If we want to make a big difference, we do it with others and through others. If you look at combined balance sheets of all the multilateral development banks, we do not have enough capital to make a sizable difference in what Laura described as a problem of the day. So what we need to do is look at the opportunities that we have through our client base, through the financial institutions that we are working with, and amplify that, because this is a true amplification of what we can do. So in IFC, we have over 700 financial institutions in our portfolio. 95% of what we do with them are targeted credit lines that are linked to forms of renewable energy, green buildings, SMEs, investments in women, et cetera, et cetera. if you educate these 700 financial institutions about how to lend green, how to green the financial system in their countries, you suddenly go from $100 billion balance sheet of IFC to several $1 trillion of potential investments. The second thing we need to do is work with regulators in emerging markets, because regulators themselves in many developing countries want to green their financial sector. And we are actually housing Sustainable Banking Network, which has already 35 banking regulators in it, and they cover about 80% of the assets, banking assets in emerging markets. So this is 35 regulators who are not listening to what IFC tells them or World Bank tells them. They are talking to each other. So we had this great opportunity last year during the spring meetings when Bangladeshi central bank regulator was learning what Indonesia has done, and they are learning from each other. So this is not us telling them what to do. This is them exchanging ideas about what needs to be done. So for scaling, and we had a couple of examples, a couple of questions here on 100 billion and Article 6. This is what we need to do to scale up, and we need to work with our clients because they are the amplifier of what we can do ourselves.
Thanks. Do you want to add to that?
Since Elzbieta sort of led me into the Article 6 conversation, there is another way to look at co-benefits. You could look at them as positive climate assets that are not accounted for when we carry out the investment. We count the percentage in terms of finance, but those co-benefits can also be translated into tons of CO2 equivalent in the case of, let's say, a mitigation project. For the last 2 years, a band of us in CCG, in the climate group, have basically based our existences on that, that you can do this. So when there's a major investment in India, if, let's say in solar, or in Bangladesh in cook stoves, or in Western Africa in a power pool, the difference this time around is that there is a national target. Sometimes it's in CO2 equivalent, sometimes it's in emissions intensity, etc. Other challenges for us. But you do have something aspirational that you can set your sights on and say, okay, from this activity, we could use all the approved methodologies and come up with a number saying that this is the co-benefit in terms of something tradable. Different matter that there is not yet a demand, so we come up with esoteric versions of Amazon in which we park our assets and wait for buyers to look at them, etc., etc. But just the basic principle is it is possible to say that you could use these same sort of quantified and monetized benefits for your own NDC targets. You don't have to sell them. When you come to selling, that's when we step in. But working up the environment around which these assets are created is distinctly something that we think is worth doing. It also tells the country how it is doing on its NDCs, whether it will have a surplus to sell or not, whether it's meeting them. There's a whole lot of stuff that we introspect on a daily basis, but there is a future and there is hope for co-benefits.
Thank you very much for that qualification on co-benefits. One question that have come up from Polev, and I think that I would like to put all of you, is to what extent the World Bank should be doing more in terms of project due diligence, where it's designing projects, incorporating the carbon pricing signals, both in terms of cost-benefit analysis and so that internalizing them so that you end up designing the projects and taking the right decisions regarding outcomes. Any views from the panel on that?
I'll get us started. We already do it. We are applying carbon pricing to all the projects that have heavy carbon footprint that accounts for about 80 to 90% of our carbon footprint today. There are not a lot of projects, but when we analyzed what our portfolio looks like, top 50 projects account for 95% of our carbon footprint. So we are doing it as of May 2018, and we are reporting to the board on individual projects for that. So I can't find a better way to do it other than trying to do it ourselves. And the second part of work is the work that we are doing together with our friends at the World Bank, Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition, which has had our first meeting on carbon pricing and competitiveness. And there's a number of working groups that are also looking at a banking sector, that are looking at construction value chain and what carbon pricing means for them. So there's quite a bit of work ongoing, and this is engaging private sector to give us feedback, how they look at the opportunities. And increasingly what we hear is that it allows them to look at projects differently, internal projects, even if there is no carbon tax mechanism in a country, it allows them to take more information into consideration when they're making their investment decisions. And this is what we want to hear.
Thank you. I want to just, please, by all means.
Just a word. It may be a sign of an internal communication problem that we haven't yet been able to get around enough the work that the SD network has done to actually develop, and I have to choose my words carefully here because I didn't spend my whole life here and I always forget what I'm allowed to say in terms of OPCS. It's advisory information. I don't want to use that word guidance because that's got a special meaning. On what kind of carbon prices would make sense from an informational point of view in evaluating public sector investment lending. That information is there. I wish I remembered the URL, but I don't. But for World Bank lending to sovereigns, we've also got an idea for what we want to do. And in fact, it's not based on old-fashioned cost-benefit analysis. It's based on a trajectory of carbon prices that's supposed to achieve the 2-degree goal. So it's not purely an economic analysis. It's is this taking us where we want to go above the economics to the, to getting this objective met. And I think that's something that is also very important not to lose track of. If I can just also augment one thing that Niraj said, because I think the CDEV program has been a very important part of what the bank's done. I've had a little exposure to this when there's been efforts to try to combine clean cooking from a carbon point of view, from a human health point of view, even a gender point of view, and look for ways to bundle financing from various parties, whether it's compliance or just climate finance or other finance, to try to get people with different interests, into the room and talking about this stuff. I think this is a tremendously innovative idea, and I hope we keep doing it and can make it grow.
Thank you very much, Mike. I think I'd like to come back to you on the issue of how to implement carbon prices later on. But before we leave this topic, Maria, anything that you hear from the World Bank Group is doing, is the IDB tagging along, is doing their own internalization of carbon pricing in your design? And are there examples, for example, from the countries of operation that you think that there are, for example, Chile or other countries that are implementing this that could be, if not best practice, certainly good practice?
I think a couple of things in terms of the carbon footprinting and the need for considering carbon pricing, even when you will do assessments of your cost-benefit analysis and so on. Indeed, is something that for a couple of years already has become a practice. And again, as I mentioned, I think there is even an alignment between the MDBs more and more to look at that. It's a challenge sometimes to say, well, how do I define actually really a shadow price, for example, if I'm doing an assessment? And it's an area where we have been having discussions, and certainly it's the same challenge for all of us, particularly when there is no real signal in the markets, no? I think there is a number of countries in the region, Latin America, that have been a bit more ambitious, like Costa Rica or Chile. And certainly the private sector in the countries that had these ambitions and have demonstrated this, ambitions being, let's say, triggered down to policies that gave certain price to carbon, allow the countries to move to more ambitious paths. It's not necessarily always called only carbon. I think it's important that the countries may have targets. For example, Mexico a number of years ago had an important energy policy that changed a lot the pattern, I think, in the last 5-10 years of Mexico. They became a large, for example, wind power producer because they had a policy target. And with that came for us the challenge, and I think all of us that work in the region, to have to finance and invest and integrate those policies. So it's not only about us telling them, but the fact that some of the countries can lead and see this as an important target helps us also to have to change the way we are doing our business in the countries. And certainly in Latin America, I think we had a couple of countries that were kind of very proactive and had a lot of creative ways to look at that.
Thank you very much. Back to carbon pricing. I had a question prepared here with my team, Mike, for you, which was the IG report finds that many client countries are unlikely to implement carbon prices or carbon taxes large enough to make a difference, via price signals, that is. how can the bank group, and again the question is for you, but anybody can chip in, can identify country-specific interventions that could enhance the emission reduction impact of the carbon pricing schemes, in other words, to provide more leverage to the carbon pricing schemes?
Again, I think this is an absolutely crucial question. The most important thing, I think, above all, is you have to take a view of the long game here. We're going to be doing this for decades. I actually don't think we should be very worried about the current carbon footprint of low-income countries in sub-Saharan Africa. They've got a lot of things to worry about. What we want to do is not have them lock into a high-carbon future when their incomes grow. Now, that can be done in different ways. It doesn't necessarily imply that it should be a price. That market may be very nascent and it may be very distorted. Energy markets often are in developing countries. It may be that some kind of technology standard is more appropriate. The thing we want to try to do, I think, and I think the lessons of the last 20 years point in this direction, and it's part of what the report, the IEG report, helps us see, is we have to get to a sector and economy level, not just project by project by project. We learned a lot doing that. But part of what we learned is that that doesn't always work very well, whether it's additionality debates or idiosyncrasies in one sector or another. The more we can make it about pushing down on the carbon growth, or even in better off countries, the current carbon footprint of an entire sector like power generation, the better, rather than one power plant or one manufacturing facility at a time. The more flexible our instruments are, the better. But that doesn't mean it has to be a price. It could be a performance standard like we have in the U.S., where in some states you have to have a certain percentage of renewable energy, but you can buy credits from other utilities that do more renewables and you get a tradable performance credit. I also think that we want to look at incentives that are nudges more of the small stick variety. We need to be very careful about what we do with subsidies. They're very valuable for getting things started, but people tend to like to keep them around even when we don't need them anymore. And as was noted, there's not enough money out there within the public sector to really give us the luxury of doing that. So we don't fixate only on prices, but we want to try to transition to them, and we want to take the long view using other instruments where necessary without precluding going to a regular carbon tax or a tradable permit system as we go.
Very much. What did you want to?
I think take a few more. I think Elizabeth already spoke to, when we move to the side of trying to influence action, Elizabeth already spoke to how financial institutions have a major role to play. On the carbon pricing leadership coalition side, what we've sought to do is to sort of reach out to the private sector, both in countries. For instance, we've just been able to get together with the Singaporeans to set up a chapter of the CPLC there. The plan is to enhance that. But effectively, can we sort of de-demonize carbon pricing? Make it simpler for, if you're an energy producer as opposed to a user. If you're in construction, she spoke to the construction value chain, where when I saw it for the first time, it was so refreshing to see that the whole chain, which part of the sequence are you working in, helps you to define what this means for you. It's not some sort of overarching one-size-fits-all demon that will come and destroy your profit line. So I think that's the kind of area where some of us have a role to push the agenda. But I think Mike's comments really resonate, because it doesn't have to be a price all the time.
Thanks very much. I think we are approaching the end of this. Oh, we have wonderful. I was going to go back to the audience, so you read my mind. Could you please state who you are and who the question is addressed to?
Thank you for the report. Oops, is it on? No. Thank you so much for the report.
One common uses.
An example of disruptive technology.
Thank you again for the report and also the panel discussion. My question is more on the future of... Oh, sorry. My name is Nuwan Suryagoda. I work in the energy practice of the World Bank. So my question is more on innovation, and how do you bring about the linkage between carbon finance and carbon markets? To be specific, the energy sector and the transport sector are transforming rapidly, and there's more electrification happening. And I know the World Bank is looking at all like middle income and low income countries. However, in terms of emission reductions and the future in the next 10 years with more electrification of the transport sector, how do you see the World Bank, both from the public sector perspective and the private sector perspective, to look at working with governments and countries in terms of, from the public sector side, looking at the strategic country diagnostics, and from the private sector side, looking at the financial markets, of how do you marry the two and create innovative instruments for the next wave of carbon finance as well as climate finance? Thank you.
And to make this challenging question even more challenging, you have each 15 seconds to reply. Who wants to take?
Question was for the
No. This is an around.
Can give an end.
This is. I think this is when something
I'll
hits
do the
fan
15
and-
seconds. 15
Please.
seconds, it's one word, incentives.
Good. What about you? One word each. This is like one of my favorite shows in the UK television, the BBC Question Time. So one word, 2 words.
Dismantle some of these things and try to see if you can get them into sound bites that make sense for people, such as the standards that Mike spoke to. When you talk of energy efficiency, is somebody prepared to sort of help finance that?
2 words.
Thinking about how you channel actually these incentives, and I think we're talking about the financial institutions, but not only, like working also with the technology producers, the technology is available. I think digital economy is also something that comes. So thinking about how you can scale up it with some of those players, there is ways to work with that don't need to go to every end user beneficiary. I think would be a better use of the climate fund.
Happy to.
I think there's a real sleeper in all this that we often forget, and that is the technology itself. And a lot of this is going to be basic R&D that no amount of carbon finance will incentivize. We need essentially a low carbon innovation club where we don't spend $15 billion a year on innovation. We spend $150 billion a year. Rich countries, middle income countries, there should be a club, public access to all the information, no monopolization. This is a global public good of some urgency, and we should put the money into it.
Thank you very much. Before we wrap up completely and thank our panel, I was wondering, John, you have been quietly sitting and nodding in several directions throughout the proceedings. Would you like to conclude sharing with us a few words of wisdom? Where do we go from here?
So first of all, before I do that, thank you very much to the IAG team for doing this. I think it stimulated a very good conversation, brought some good ideas to the table, and we're moving. I think we don't have right now certainty on where these carbon markets are going to go and when they're going to go. However, if you just look at the potential benefit, the volumes that could flow, and the benefit that these instruments could have to reducing the costs of meeting our mitigation targets, I'm willing to bet that by 2023, 2025, I don't know what that date is, we will have much more functional carbon markets that are operating with plumbing and rules and decent prices. I'm pretty sure that's where we're going to get to. I think our role then is to think about how can we build the building blocks very quietly to get us there. What will accelerate it, and how can we take this vast treasure trove of knowledge and experience that we have to shape what is going to happen? But not in a view of saying, listen, we know exactly what the next 5 steps are, one after another, in order to get there. But what are the building blocks that we can put in place that will encourage the world to get there based on not ideology, but the good analytic experience that we have. So I think there's a huge opportunity. I'm really pleased to, first of all, have this report and then have the opportunity for all of us within the bank group and our partners at Inter-American Bank and others, the European Union, to drive this agenda forward. So thank you.
Thank you very much, John. With those words of inspirational and aspirational words, the only thing remaining is to thank you all for being here, and please join me in a show of hands for this wonderful panel and for the people